So I a little delayed and get these last two videos out for this week. So my apologies for that. Nice thing is you've had access to the old ones. So I try and redo these every semester. Anyway, we're going to talk about fatigue specifically. So our objectives are as follows. So this is going to be a little bit on the lengthy side. Not too bad though. So we need to start out with some definitions and then figure out what contributes. And then we're going to talk about RPE, which you should have covered in lab already, and then the central governor theory. So what is fatigue? And simply put, fatigue is where we have a decrease in performance, whether that's muscular performance or you're just not able to, however you want to define that. It's your just inability to continue doing something at the level that you were originally doing it at. All right. And there's not necessarily just any one cause. It's multifactorial. So in other words, there's a lot of things that go into this. One of the things that's important to know about fatigue, though, is that it's reversible. This isn't an injury. This isn't weakness. It's fatigue. Okay? Injury is very different. Weakness is very different. Now, when it comes to fatigue, we can look at it in terms of something being central fatigue or peripheral fatigue. With central fatigue, this is changes that are occurring in the central nervous system or in the brain. Okay? And so I want you to, kind of go back in your mind and think about how you have a neuron that sends an action potential to a muscle cell. Okay, so there are many steps along that process. And so basically with central fatigue, we're talking about anything that's occurring in the nerve up and until acetylcholine binds to the muscle cell. If something prevents that from happening, we would consider that central fatigue. So really it's alterations in the nervous system. All right. And so there's a lot of ways that this can happen. So I'm going to give you a list of things, but it's not the only thing that can happen or the only things. So you could have just reduced acetylcholine release. So if that happens, less acetylcholine binds to the muscle, which means fewer action potentials in the muscle, fewer cross bridges, that sort of thing. Dopamine, actually, if you have less dopamine, this can also cause central fatigue. You have reduced arousal. Okay, and so dopamine's kind of excitatory, and if you just have less of it, then you're going to be less likely to kind of continue doing what you're doing. Increased serotonin, though, on the other hand, is kind of interesting that if you have high levels of serotonin, it increases your RPE, or how hard you think that you're working, and so that can also lead to fatigue. All right, and then we've got peripheral fatigue, and so this is where you have changes in the muscle itself. Okay, and so you could have decreased rate of energy delivery. In other words, you're not creating ATP, you're not delivering ATP as quickly as possible. You've got accumulation of byproducts such as hydrogen ion. So we've talked that hydrogen ion is produced. We know that it's an acid. Acid's bad. Acid burn things. That's kind of how we think about it. But one of the things that acid does, or hydrogen ion does specifically, is it makes it difficult for calcium to bind to troponin. And if troponin doesn't bind, or if calcium doesn't bind to troponin, tropomyosin isn't moved out of the way. Actin and myosin don't bind, which means you have fewer cross bridges. Remember, fewer cross bridges equals less force. And ultimately, this or other things can cause the contractile mechanism, so actin and myosin binding, forming those cross bridges, which then go through the sliding filament theory, or go through that cross bridge cycling is probably a better way to put it. Then we have that failure, so you have fatigue. Now with fatigue, one of the ways that we can determine a level of fatigue, or at least get an idea of how fatigued someone's feeling, is with the rating of perceived exertion. And so I believe you've seen this in lab the last couple of weeks. And so we've got the Borg scale. It's 6 to 20, but it's subjective. Okay, there's no real way to measure how fatigued someone is, and this is an easier way to do it. But you have to remember it's subjective. So what I think is a 7, you might think is a 12, or vice versa. Okay, the most common scale for RPE is this 6 to 20 Borg scale, which can be very confusing not only to you, but to subjects especially who have no idea what's going on. If you ask somebody on a scale of 6 to 20, how hard do you feel like you're working? That really kind of throws people. And so that's why these words are so important. The great thing about the Borg scale is it's actually pretty accurate. And what we mean by that is that this generally lets someone work out at a specific target heart rate. And the reason being is that it correlates, the RPE scale correlates very well with heart rate. So just think of, instead of at 6, you're at a 60, your heart rate's at 60. Or if you're at a 15, your heart rate's at 150, okay? So this works really well for younger people. You just multiply by 10, and that's hopefully what your heart rate's at, okay, give or take. Now, so there are some other things that can cause fatigue, such as depletion of phosphocreatine. Remember, that's the fuel source or the system that we use at the very beginning of exercise. So short-term, high intensity. You get up, you sprint, that sort of thing. Phosphocreatine we need so we can build that ATP. The problem is it takes a little while longer to replenish or take the phosphocreatine. Remember, we break it down into creatine and phosphate. It takes longer to put it back together than it does to take it apart. And so if we have low levels of phosphocreatine and or ATP, then we become fatigued. Okay. Another way that we can become fatigued is if we don't have enough glycogen. Okay. Remember, we store glycogen not only in our muscle, but in the liver. And if our muscle glycogen is depleted, or the goal of it, like it says here, is to maintain muscle ATP. Okay. And so while we have glycogen in our muscles, we actually get rid of that or use it really quickly in the beginning of exercise. Okay. And so if we've got super low levels of glycogen in our muscle, this appears to be one of the main factors that it causes someone to hit the wall. Okay. And I don't think many of us have actually experienced hitting the wall, but it can happen, right? So cyclists refer to it as bonking, that sort of thing. And so there's some evidence, or lots of evidence, to suggest that when a person hits the wall, they've got low levels of muscle glycogen. Now, as we said a minute ago, there are other byproducts that are produced during the formation of ATP and exercise and that sort of thing. And these metabolic byproducts can also cause fatigue, one of which is heat. Remember, heat is a measure of temperature. Temperature is a measure of kinetic energy. Heat speeds up chemical reactions. So if we've got a high temperature, we're going to go through glucose and glycogen much quicker. All right. Remember, lactate doesn't cause fatigue, but it's correlated with fatigue. Okay. And so we'll get into that more a little bit later, but just it's not the cause, but it's something that can give us an idea. Okay. And then we've got hydrogen ion. And as we said a little while earlier, hydrogen ion is essentially acid. This causes acidosis. Like we said, it can prevent the binding of actin and myosin. Okay. And it can actually prevent strong binding. So if you've got it on actin and myosin, as well as preventing calcium from binding to troponin. And it can also inhibit the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, which helps maintain membrane potential. Okay. And so that can cause some problems if we're not able to get those potassium ions back in, those sodium ions back out. And just like the sodium pump, it can inhibit the calcium pump. And remember, the calcium pump, we're pumping calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum so that when the next action potential comes down, we have a lot of calcium that can be released so that we can have more cross bridges formed, which can lead to stronger contraction. Okay, and ultimately, hydrogen ion can inhibit glycolysis. If we have high levels of hydrogen ion that we're unable to get rid of, glycolysis will slow down. So just kind of a quick review. So with the neuromuscular fatigue, this is on the neural side. So this is peripheral fatigue. But neuromuscular fatigue, if we're taking it together, there's just lots of different things that can happen. So we can change how much acetylcholine is being released. We can increase the activity of cholinesterase, which is the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. We can also decrease it. Okay. And all of these things that I've got listed here are going to ultimately affect how well or how easy it is for a muscle to contract, for muscle contractions to occur, cross bridges to form, that sort of thing. Okay. So the last thing that I want to mention here is the central governor theory. Now, when you hear governor, I'm not necessarily talking about someone that leads a state. I'm thinking of something that's more along the lines of like an engine governor. So if you've ever been golfing before, most golf carts that you rent from a golf course have what's called a governor that it's on them. Moving trucks also have a governor on them, and this prevents the engine from being used to its maximum capacity. So really it limits the speed. Okay, so like when I was moving across the country, the moving truck we were in, the fastest I could go was 70 miles an hour. Okay, even though there are places in this country, and I think places that I drove where the speed limit's 75. That's cool. I couldn't drive faster than 70 because Penske, who I believe I rented the truck from, had set it up so that the engine wouldn't go faster than 70. And so that's a governor. So when it comes to your brain can act like a governor. Basically, it says, hey, I'm going to stop recruiting motor units. And the reason I'm doing this is I'm going to prevent injury from occurring. What you're trying to do could ultimately cause some serious injury, so I know what's best, and we're just going to prevent that from happening. Now, it is possible to overcome this, but it's very difficult. All right? And so what the central governor theory does is it actually stops muscle contraction from occurring, or ends muscle contraction before the muscle is completely exhausted. In other words, the muscle can't do anymore. So the central governor theory is kind of an anticipatory mechanism to prevent injury and to prevent complete and total exhaustion. And so that's where we're going to end with fatigue.